evening. Good evening, and welcome to the Fall 2014 Dean's Distinguished Lecture. I'm Eileen Klein-Sorge, the College of Business Dean and holder of the Sarah Hart Kimball Chair. Before I introduce our speaker, I have a question for all of you. When you were a child, how many of you were asked, what do you want to be when you grow up? I can imagine that many of you may have answered, I want to be a firefighter, a teacher, an engineer, policeman, a doctor, an astronaut, a dancer, or a basketball player, or even perhaps an architect. But how many of you ever answered, I want to be a futurist? Well, I doubt many of you, because I certainly didn't even know what a futurist was when I was a child. But this past January, I met a futurist, and I was intrigued. I was speaking at a conference of Intel finance professionals, and I was scheduled to speak after the futurist. Imagine me, a dean and a professor of accounting, following a futurist. While I could have sat and worried about my own remarks, I was captivated by his message and was actually inspired. And after hearing him, I was so busy plotting my plan to get him on campus so that you could be inspired too, that I fear I may have failed to remember what my own remarks were supposed to be. It wasn't just his job title that intrigued me. It was an interesting time to hear his message. The college had just adopted a code of honor focused on integrity, respect, and responsibility. And the faculty were also working on a curriculum to address change in workforce demands driven by the infamous title, Big Data. As he spoke of the future and asked for us to consider something better, and I wore my own wearable technology, my Fitbit, I pondered, what could the data being collected by my own Fitbit, how it might be used to better the human condition? I thought about the future for higher education and the success of our graduates. We want our graduates to be known for having integrity, for respecting the work that they do, for respecting colleagues and taking responsibility for their actions, and to be the most current on how business is good for our communities and for the world. So literally, just 2 weeks after the faculty approved the Code of Honor, I was at Intel campus listening to Brian David Johnson talk about what comes after greed, and the talk about how technology can do good in society, that business is good for our communities, that there is room for more than just profits, that in fact the technology we build is an extension of ourselves and the ethics that are instilled in each of us. At a time when technology surrounds us and at a time when it dictates how we live, we still have a choice of what it means to us as individuals and to all of humanity. There were similar conversations that we were having at the college among our students, faculty, peers, and colleagues. You can understand why I immediately developed a plan to introduce him to you. This is an important conversation to have right now for students, for faculty, for the College of Business, for the Oregon State community, and beyond. I'm excited to introduce you to Brian David Johnson, Intel's futurist. Brian?
Thank you very much. Wow, that's an introduction. Holy moly. Hi, everybody. What we're going to do this evening is we're going to talk about this notion of humanity in the machine. And I'm going to set my timer because We're going to talk a little bit, and then we're going to have a little Q&A up here. And then after that, we're going to play a game that I like to play called Ask Me Anything. I am a futurist. I've been a futurist for about 20 years, so you can ask me anything you want at the sort of the end of the Q&A, and I think we've got some incentives and some giveaways. You can people have asked me everything from like, when will the robo-apocalypse happen, to when could we put jets on the equator to slow down the spin of the Earth so that we could have a 30-hour day. Literally, people ask me anything. So you can ask me anything. So we'll kind of do that at the end. But what I want to do now is talk to you a little bit about what a futurist is, what a futurist does, some of the work that I'm been doing, but mainly about this project that I've been on called Humanity in the Machine, which was really a personal journey of mine that led me really to this stage and the work that I've been doing. So if you read my first slide very, very closely, you will see it says that I work for a large company and we have a lot of lawyers. Okay, you saw that, right? I said that we did that. Okay, now let's move on. Okay, who am I? So, my name is Brian David Johnson. I am a futurist. I am the futurist at Intel, the chip company. It's my job to look 10 to 15 years out and model how people will act and interact with technology. Essentially, I model what it will feel like to be a human and live in the future. Now, I do that because at Intel, it takes us about 5 to 10 years to design, develop, and deploy the chip, right? The chip that goes into your laptops and your tablets and goes into the servers. It takes us about 5 to 10 years to do that. So it's of vital business importance today for Intel to know what people will want to do 10 years from now. Now, I'm a principal engineer at the company. Really, my day job is to deliver a spec to say these are the capabilities of the platform. And you'll find that I'm a very pragmatic futurist. My success is judged by, oh, look, there's people up there too. Hey, how you doing? That's cool. Hey. So you'll find that my success is judged not only by the clarity of this vision, this 10-year out vision, but the ability for my colleagues to take action on it. So what do we need to do today to get to that future? Now, you can pretty much tell everything you need to know about me by looking at this picture. If you haven't figured it out, this is a picture of me at age 13. Now, like I said, I'll draw your eye to a very specific area. So you can literally tell everything you need to know about me by this picture. Now, if you can't actually see what is on my wrist, ladies and gentlemen, that is a calculator watch, thus proving, without a doubt, I'm a nerd. Let's be clear, I am a huge nerd. I love everything science, I love everything science fiction, and I get to bring these things together in the work that I do. So let's talk about the future for a minute. So when you're building a future, when you're doing this work, you have to start with a vision. You have to have an opinion, right? You have to say, this is what we think the future is going to look like. And so typically, when we're shown images of the future, this is usually what we're shown, right? We get this in advertising, we get this in movies. This is usually what the future looks like. We've got some good-looking guy or some good-looking gal, right? They're usually in front of this really cool, streamlined device, and they're usually in this like super cool like apartment, right? That's really sort of pared down. Now, I can tell you that when I look at this, I hate this picture. Because when I look at this picture, if this is actually a picture of what the future is going to look like, I ask myself, where are the baby toys? I ask myself, where are the pillows? I ask myself, where are the family photos? Right? Where's the stuff? Where are the things that make us human? That's the wonderful thing about humans, is that we're incredibly complicated. We have different cultures, we have different backgrounds, we have different religious beliefs. That's what makes us awesome, is the fact that we're so complicated. And so if we're really doing the real work of building the future and envisioning what the future might look like, when I look at this, at best, I find it intellectually dishonest. And at worst, I find it insulting. I find it insulting to the awesomeness that is humanity. It has stripped it all away. It has made us inhuman. Now, I can also say I hate this picture because this picture comes from Intel, my company, which doesn't make me a lot of friends in the marketing department, just so we're clear. Now, on my next slide, I actually have a picture of what the future is actually going to look like. Who would like to see it? Oh, you're all so polite. There was one guy in the back who went, yeah. You're awesome, dude, whoever did that. You're so polite. So I spend a lot of time as a futurist out talking to students, talking to young minds, because you're the ones who are going to build the future. And I was speaking once back on the East Coast to a room of 600 engineering students. Do we have any engineering students in the house? Raise their hands. Okay, so like that guy right there is like the hardest audience ever. Like engineering students, they're like, nothing impresses them. So I'm there, I'm Intel's Futurist, and I'm showing them this, I'm like, hey, who wants to see the future? Completely silent. Except for one kid way in the back who goes, sure. I'm like, really? That's what I get? Sure. All right, so I'm going to show you what the future looks like, but I'm going to have to warn you, you can't unsee what I'm about to show you. Literally, you will define your life between this slide and the next slide. Literally, you will tell your children, I saw the future. You will be forever changed. Okay? Ready? Okay, hold on to somebody near to you because it's going to be, you're going to feel it. Okay? Really, that's all I'm going to get? Okay, here we go. Bam! Now, I have to tell you that this picture, pound for pound, has more future in it than the previous picture. She has a laptop, she has a connected smartphone, she has a connected TV, and a connected picture frame. But the reason why I like this is because it's real. This actually comes from social science research that we've done in my lab, but this is real, right? It's full of stuff. There's stuff on the chest of drawers, the drawers open, at the bottom she's in her bare feet. This is human. So as I start to think about what the future could look like and what the future will look like, I want to design a future for real human beings. I want to design a future that embraces the complexity and diversity of human beings, not that strips it away, right? This is the type of future I want to live in. I don't want to live in a future that looks like this because this looks like prison. I don't want to live in this future. I want to live in this future. This is comfortable. She literally has a pillow down there at the bottom, and that pillow says, chill out. That's the type of future I want to live in, and that's the type of future I want to design for. So the work that I do is called future casting. We can talk about it during the Ask Me Anything if you want. The process basically starts with social science. It starts with an ethnographic understanding of human beings. It then looks at the technology and where technology is going. It then looks at the economics, the kind of math of the future, if you will, like GDP, population growth, things like that. And then uses a bunch of global interviews. I spend most of my time on a plane, actually. I spend most of my time traveling, actually talking to people about the future. And when you bring all of that together, it says, this is what we roughly think it's going to feel like to live and be a human being in the future. And then we embrace the fact that the future is built every day by the actions of people, that people build the future. And so we say, what is the future we want and what is the future we want to avoid? So knowing that we have that choice. And then we start to say, well, what are the steps that we need to take today to get to that future we want and to avoid that future we don't want? That's the kind of pragmatic approach that we take. Now, in the work that I've been doing, really about 5 or 6 years ago, this fact changed everything about how I thought about the future. Now, what this says is that as we approach the year 2020, the size of meaningful computational power begins to approach 0. And what we mean by that is today we're at 14 nanometers. Our chips, the intelligence that goes into all of our machines, are at 14 nanometers. As we approach the year 2020, we go down to 5 nanometers. And 5 nanometers is 12 atoms across. And that means we can turn anything into a computer. We could turn this rug into a computer. We could turn my jacket into a computer. We could even turn my body into a computer. And this fundamentally changes the question that we have to ask ourselves when we're developing technology, and I would argue when we're developing businesses for the future. Because for decades we had to ask ourselves, can we do something? Can we make a desktop small enough to fit onto somebody's lap? Can we make a laptop small enough to fit into somebody's pocket or their pocketbook with a smartphone or a tablet? It was, can we do it? But when you have the size of meaningful computational power approaching 0, it means we can turn anything into a computer. So we don't have to ask ourselves, can we do it? We have to ask ourselves, what? What do we want to do, and why do we want to do it? And I would argue, and we'll talk about as we go through this, is I would argue that really what we need to do, the bar that we need to set for ourselves, is we need to say, how can we do this? How can we use this to make people's lives better? How can we take all of this intelligence and make people more productive, more sustainable, healthier, happier, more entertained? But we should set that bar. Now, I love this graphic. You probably, I don't know if you can see it. Can you see the woman in the 1960s? She's got a bouffant hairdo. Can you see the dude in the 1970s? He's got bell bottoms on. Can anybody guess who the person is in the year 2010? Thus proving that that person who said Steve Jobs is smarter than I am. Because I had this graphic for like a month, and I had no idea that was Steve Jobs. And so I called the graphics people, and I said, did you know that that's Steve Jobs? And they started laughing. They're like, yeah, we know. It took you like weeks to figure it out. And then they did the thing that they love to do. They went, Futurist, and hung up on me. So where does this all push us? So we have the size of meaningful computational power approaching 0. Great. OK, fine. What does that mean? One of the things that it means is that we are moving into an age of big data. Now, go and when people talk about big data, you can have some fun. Go to them when people start talking about big data and you want to talk about big data. You say, push them on it. Say, well, tell me about big data. What's it going to feel like to live in this age of big data? And they will tell you, well, the data is big. And you say, okay. Tell me more about this big data, this age of big data. What else about it? They'll say, well, there's a lot of data. Okay. And you push them, and usually people can't talk about the implications. They can't actually talk about what it will actually be like. What will we do with all of this data? Aside from its bigness, what will it do? So one of the things that I've been looking at is to say, well, we can start thinking about this data as taking on a life of its own. That you will have machines talking to machines. You'll have algorithms talking to algorithms. And data will essentially have a life of its own. It will go off and do things. It will have a secret life. And this is a good thing. This is a very good thing, because that data can go off and do amazing stuff for us, right? It can make us more efficient. It can make us more sustainable. It can make us healthier and happier and more entertained. But the thing that we have to remember is that all these ones and zeros, all this big data and the bigness and massiveness of big data and cloud computing means absolutely nothing until it comes down and touches the lives of people. All of those ones and zeros are meaningless until it connects with people. Because everything we do, whether it be in technology, whether it be in business, whether it be in education, it's always about people. It's always about people. Ultimately, it's about people connecting with other people. And so for me, when I think about the secret life of data and I think about where things could go and what we could do, you'll find that I'm an optimist, if you haven't figured that out yet. Right? I'm an optimist. I believe very firmly that the future is built every day by the actions of people. The future is not an accident. The future doesn't just happen. It is built every day by the actions of people. So if the future is built every day by the actions of people, why don't we go and build an awesome future? Let's not go out and build a future that sucks. Let's actually make a decision to make a better future. So it makes me an optimist, because I think that we can actually work together. So when I see the promise of big data, this is sort of where I see things going, is that we could actually make people healthier, that we could actually go and make people just more entertained or more connected. So this was kind of my thinking around about 5 or 6 years ago, was thinking about this. And then something happened. May the 6th, 2010, this happened. Does anybody know what this is? Flash crash. This is the flash crash of 2010. What happened in the flash crash of 2010 is, in the span of just a few hours, you had high-frequency trading and algorithms that essentially crashed the stock market. Now, I was actually in New York City at the time when this happened. And so I'm walking down the street, and most people, we didn't figure it out until May the 7th. They didn't actually know what happened. And so I'm actually walking down the street, and there's a sign, literally the headline on the newspaper says, "Machines crash the stock market." And like I said, the thing that really scared people wasn't that machines crashed the stock market, is they didn't know why. It really freaked them out, like deeply freaked people out. I would go, and I was there and actually went to ABC News and went to people and actually talked to them about it, and people were really, really scared, as if the machines had taken over and literally lost millions and millions of dollars, and they couldn't stop it. Now, this freaked me out. And it didn't freak me out because of the fact that I thought the machines had crashed the internet, but what worried me is it shook my optimism. Again, I believe in the secret life of data. I believe that we will use all of these technologies to make people's lives better. And here was an example that people were talking about, that the machines took over and literally hurt people, hurt financial portfolios, and did damage to people. And it really, really bothered me. And so I went out and started studying it. So if this was true, I wanted to investigate it. So what I did is I started working on this project called Humanity in the Machine. And so I went out and said, well, let's learn about high-frequency trading. What is it? And so, I went out and actually talked to flash traders and high-frequency traders who go out and do this type of work. I talked to people who write the algorithms. I talked to economists about it. And again, high-frequency trading, it's been in the press actually a lot more recently, but it's not that big a deal. It really is just using algorithms and using servers and software to trade, do stock trades, essentially at the speed of light. Which, by the way, when I was researching it, I thought was pretty awesome, because sort of any business that's based upon the speed of light is pretty cool. And so I started kind of going around and investigating it and asking people about sort of high-frequency trading. And the thing that I learned is, when it comes to algorithms, right, these things that sort of crashed the stock market, an algorithm really is kind of like a recipe. Right? Again, there's nothing sort of complicated about an algorithm. It's a series of steps, a series of sequential steps that you take that gets you to an end. It's a lot like baking a cake. It's like a cake recipe, right? You take sort of flour and eggs, and you put it together, and you beat it, and you put it in the chocolate, and then you put it in a pan, and you put it in the oven, and you pull it out, and boom, you got a cake. It's the same thing. With an algorithm, you tell it to take very specific steps with an end. And in this case, the end was maximizing profit. So it turns out the machines didn't crash the stock market. Humans crashed the stock market. And as I started talking to the different economists who I do work with, when they talk about the history of stock markets, they can actually see the entire history of the American stock market as a series of panics and crashes. That literally, if you have a market, and you put human beings in that market, you're going to have bad behavior. And that's what got me to this question about what comes after greed. Because when you start to optimize these algorithms for profit, there's nothing wrong with profit. I mean, as you know, sort of being in school, profit is just an economic metric, right? It's the return that you get from sort of goods and natural resources. There's nothing wrong with profit. Where profit goes off the rails is when you bring human beings into the equation. Because the cool thing about human beings is that we're diverse and we're quirky and we do stuff, but also human beings can do bad things as well. And what turns profit into greed is human beings. And I don't know what you think about greed, but I can tell you one of the things that really we know about greed is, I think it's number 3 on the lists of things that will send you to hell. Not so good. So I asked, what comes after greed? Can we optimize for something other than greed and profit? And the economists that I worked with kind of shook their heads and said, Brian, nothing gives economists greater consternation than optimizing for anything but profit. So I said, okay, but what can we do? Can we optimize for something else? So I went back to the traders and I said, can you optimize for something other than profit? And they said, of course I can. What do you want to optimize for? I can write the machine, I can write the algorithm to do whatever we want. How about we optimize for quality? How about we optimize for sustainability? There's metrics that allow us to do that. You can begin to look at, like a great example is liquidity, right? So most of these algorithms were designed for liquidity, which is the amount of which a stock is traded. So a stock that gets traded a lot is a stock that gets traded a lot. A stock that doesn't get traded a lot doesn't exist to these algorithms. So he said we could flip that. We could actually look at these new metrics and tell the machine to sniff something out. And so they asked me this question, and they kind of pointed out this fact that it's all about what you're optimizing for, and that it's a choice. And this became the overriding question for me that I started asking everybody that I would talk to. When I would deal with colleagues or I would talk to people who were coming up with new business ideas. I teach in an MBA program. I teach long-term strategic foresight in an MBA program. And I would start asking this question. And it's an incredibly clarifying question. When people come to you, you can say, okay, well, tell me what you're optimizing for. And so I went out and I started asking people. I started doing investigations to say, what are we optimizing for? Can we optimize in business? Can we optimize for something other than greed, other than profit? And I found out, yeah, you can. I went and talked to a group of people who were doing peer-to-peer lending. Right? These were folks who were lending to individuals who banks literally couldn't lend to. The math didn't work out. Banks just couldn't do it. And I would go and talk to them and say, well, what are you optimizing for? And they would say, well, that's easy, Brian, we're optimizing for the American dream. We want to be able to lend money, and we've learned that if we can lend small amounts of money to these people, it gives them just enough a leg up so that they can start experiencing the American dream. I went and talked to a young entrepreneur by the name of Crystal Beasley. And Crystal thinks that you can optimize for the happiness of entrepreneurs, especially in the VC world, right? The VC world where you put a bunch of bets on 10, 20 different companies and you grind them out to get to an IPO. And Crystal had actually seen, she had been through this process, but she had actually seen people's lives destroyed. She had literally seen a friend of hers almost driven to the point of suicide because of this system. And she and I were chatting, and she said, this makes no sense. Because if you're an entrepreneur, you're not just going to have one good idea, you're going to have 10 good ideas. So how about we set up a venture capitalist system that doesn't try to grind you out to an IPO, but that actually fosters the imagination and fosters the happiness of these entrepreneurs so they can not only benefit from the one good idea, but the 10 good ideas that they're going to get. That you could actually make more money by making people happy and fostering that creativity. And then even I went and talked to some colleagues of mine at the US government in the Army who were doing work optimizing these things, optimizing our smartphones, to treat PTSD, to treat our soldiers as they come back from the battlefield and have this awful, awful condition, post-traumatic stress syndrome. And the terrible thing about PTSD is it's always there. It is always with you. And your family members, even if they love you dearly, can't be with you all the time. And certainly the doctor can't be with the soldier all the time. But these can be. So what if we start optimizing these devices to start, keeping an eye on the soldier? Are they getting up? Are they moving? What music are they listening to? Are they communicating? And so if they aren't, this then can become the agent. This can become the thing that reaches out to a family member and says, hey, this soldier hasn't it doesn't seem like they're doing too well. Why don't you give them a call? Or if it gets to even a worse point, it can actually be a lifeline that reaches out to the healthcare system. And that, to me, really started to clarify what we could do with this notion of humanity and the machine. It started to say, what if we understood and owned the fact that the technology that we build, that the businesses that we come up with, are actually imbued with our sense of humanity? That realizing that everything that we do, everything that we make, we put ourselves in it. We put our cultural values, we put our ethics, we put our hopes, we put our dreams into these businesses and into these technologies. That we imbue them with who we are. Again, that's not a bad thing. That's the wonderful thing about human beings, is that we're cultural, value-based systems. And so it makes perfect sense that when we make these things, we imbue them with that. But it pushes us to then be held accountable. Because one of the things at the latter part of the book, as I started thinking about, okay, we can optimize for whatever we want to optimize for. It's a choice. We make that decision ourselves to say, this is what I'm going to optimize for. You could optimize for profit. You could optimize for the American dream. You could optimize your devices to take care of people that you love. But you have to own the fact that that's what you do. And at the end of the book, I started looking at, well, what if we don't do that? And it led me to this idea of the nature of evil. And the nature of evil isn't some demonic force trying to do bad things to good people. What a lot of clinical studies have shown us and a lot of war crimes trials is what the nature of evil is thoughtlessness. Not thinking about what you're doing. Not thinking about the effect that your deeds will do. So if we're not embracing the fact that we imbue our devices and our businesses and our structures with our humanity, if we're not owning up to that responsibility, then we're actually creating machines of evil, businesses of evil, if we're not owning up to that. Now, the other side of it is quite different. If we own up to that, if we say, okay, I understand that I imbue what I build with my values, you can actually start to create the better half of ourselves. Because these machines and these businesses don't have ego. They don't have the complicated side of human beings, that sort of, the bad things that have sort of happened in the history of stock markets. You can actually create machines to take care of people you love. You can create businesses that go out and do good and actually take care of communities. You can actually then create these things to be our better angels, to not be flawed like human beings, but actually go out and do good. As you sit in this audience right now, you are living in an amazing time. You are living in a time where our science and our technology, and I would argue our businesses and our ability to build and do business, is only constrained by the limits of our imagination. Think about that for a second. It's crazy, right? We're saying that the thing that holds us back is not our science, it's not our technology, it's not our social networks, it's not our business acumen. The thing that holds us back is our imaginations. It is literally our inability to imagine a far more awesome future than we have today. And that the thing that we need to foster, the thing that we need to develop not only in ourselves, but to develop in our peers, is this imagination, is to push ourselves. And also what I would argue as you start to think about this is how you come up with this imagination, how you come up with these visions of the future is you don't do it by yourself. Almost everything we do as human beings is collaborative. We work with people. And so I would also push you that one of the things that also holds us back and limits our imagination is a lack of diversity. That as you start to create these images of the future, you have to remember that the future involves everybody. So that means a diversity of age, that means a diversity of gender, it means a diversity of ethnicity. That if we're going to imagine these amazing futures, these futures that could be full of wonder, you actually have to go and talk to people. You have to talk to people who aren't like you. You have to go and talk to people who you don't agree with, because the future involves everybody. You also have to go talk to people you probably don't even like, because the future involves everybody. And the way that you come up with this imagination is by having those types of conversations. It is incredibly important, because that is the thing that holds us back. Now, as a futurist, and working at a place like Intel, I take my job very seriously. I realize that if I get my job right, that I actually can touch the lives of almost everybody on this planet. That I've been at Intel for over a decade, and the work that I have done, the chips that I have built have been rolling off. And the thing at Intel, if you don't know about us, we measure a lot of what we do in billions, literally billions of chips. And I started feeling an incredible responsibility. Right? At first I just thought it was cool and awesome that we were making all these great things, because remember, I'm a nerd, and I'm making lots of cool devices, and it was great. And then they started rolling off the line, and they started showing up all over the world, and I realized, wait a minute, this is an incredible platform. This is a platform to actually go out and actually start touching those lives of people. Actually, there was a sense of responsibility now that I had as I was starting to create these chips, that we imbue them with our sense of humanity. So what do we do? Right? So the future, again, isn't an accident. The future is made by people, by the actions of people, every day. So if we're going to make a future, how do we change it? If we come up with an imagination and we come up with a far more awesome future, a more radical, different future, how do we change it? So I kind of traveled around and talked to a bunch of experts and folks in the military and in universities. I was in New York, I was in London with a colleague of mine by the name of Cory Doctorow. And Cory is an activist and a science fiction writer. And he and I were arguing about this, going back and forth. And then we ended up hitting, I think, on a very simple and quite elegant solution. That how you change the future is you change the story that people tell themselves about the future that they will live in. Really simple, but really powerful. Because if you can change the story that people tell themselves about the future that they will live in, they will make different decisions. They will make different education decisions. They will make different purchase decisions. They will literally start to create a different future. And the way that you change that story is, number one, to have an opinion. To have an opinion about the future. Right? To be able to, certainly base it on fact, but also use that imagination, use that skill that you fostered to go out and have a vision for the future. And then go talk to somebody and say, this is where I see things going, this is the future I want, and this is the future I want to avoid, and then find out what they think. And if you're lucky, they'll disagree with you. Because, by the way, that's the one thing that I completely look for. If you really want me to think you like me, disagree with me. Because the whole point of what we do when we're doing this work is not to be right. It's ridiculous to want that, to be the one to say, I said this and I was the person, I was right. The whole point is to get it right. The whole point is to be able to create businesses and technologies that touch people's lives and make their lives better. That's the point. And the only way that you're going to do that is to seek out people who don't agree with you, is to seek out people who you can argue with, and also find people who do agree with you that you can work together. But it is that process. And it's through those conversations that you will actually change that story. Now, because you're here, because you're sitting in this audience, you're now accountable. And what I mean by that is, once you own the fact that we imbue our organizations and our technologies and our businesses with our values and our sense of humanity, you can't turn away from that. You can't. Because if you do, you literally begin to create works of evil. You cannot turn away. You have to have and own up that you have the responsibility for the things that you create. And the second thing is, I'll hold you accountable because you showed up tonight. There are a lot of you in this room right now. Like a whole lot of you. There's people up there. It's awesome. You care. That's why you're here. That's why you're at this school. That's why you're studying what you're studying, because you actually care about the future. And it matters. And so I'm going to ask you to own up to the fact that you will change the future. You will change the future of your family. You will change the future of your community, of your college, of your church. And if you apply yourself and you start to think about it, it's a decision that you make. And you don't have to stop there. You can change the future of this state. You can change the future of this country, even of the world. But it's a decision that you have to make. And it's something that you can't shirk. It's nothing you can move away from. You have to own the fact that you will build the future and you will change the future. And so my question to you then is, what are you going to do? And it is my humble ask that in anything that you do, whatever your choice is, always try to make the lives of people better. Because if you can do that, if we hold the bar that high, then you'll not only do good business, we'll make awesome technologies, you'll really great stuff. But if you hold yourself to that higher bar, you will actually change the world. Now, my final slide, so now we're going to move into the other phase of this evening. So we're going to start, you can start thinking of questions that you might want to ask. But my final slide takes a little bit of a story. As I was coming up in industry, my first job, or one of my first jobs, was I was a speechwriter for executives. This is before I was at Intel. And I wrote speeches for my executives. And one of my executives, in every single speech or every single presentation that he had me do, I always had to include a picture of dogs playing poker. I was young. I didn't ask why. I said, yes, sir. And I got really good at it. In every single presentation I showed, there was a picture of dogs playing poker. So if there was a screen, there'd be a picture of dogs playing poker. If there was a podium, there'd be a picture of dogs playing poker. Literally, I got to know this picture way too well. Hopefully you guys know this picture. You have the little bulldog, and he's got a little card in his toe. Dogs playing poker. So finally, at the end of my time with this executive, I got up the guts to ask him. I said, sir, why did we have to include a picture of dogs playing poker in every single presentation? And he kind of smiled at me and said, Brian, people love pictures of dogs playing poker. Why wouldn't you include pictures of dogs playing poker in every single presentation? And he was right. So I've taken on that tradition. I've taken on that mantle. But in every single presentation I give, I don't include pictures of dogs playing poker. What I do include are pictures of animals using technology. The longer you look at this, the more freaked out you're going to get. All right, and with that, I want to say thank you so much. Thank you so much for showing up tonight, and we'll move on.
So now, don't we all want to be futurists? I can imagine in 20 years from now, and young children are asked what you want to be when you grow up, a futurist may just exactly be it. So at this time, I'd like to introduce Dr. Jeff Barden, an assistant professor in the College of Business. Professor Barden joined the Strategy and Entrepreneurship faculty in September of 2013 and currently teaches strategy to MBA and undergraduate students. With a research focus on interorganizational relationships, entrepreneurship, and technology, he has been published in such journals as Strategic Organizations, Sports Management, Strategic Management, and Business Venturing. This evening, Professor Barden will be hosting the moderated session of the program, and then we will open it up for conversation to questions from you. So be thinking of your questions. There might be a prize. So, Jeff?
Welcome to Oregon State. It's a pleasure to have you. It was a fascinating presentation. We have a lot of really enthusiastic and bright young people here, and they're all just launching their careers. And so we have to take this opportunity, right? You have this wonderful job, right? You have the coolest job title in the world, maybe, right? So tell us a little bit about your career progression. You did a little bit in your presentation, but right. I'm interested in the nuts and bolts and what brought you to this. And what advice would you offer these young people?
Okay. Well, so as you saw from my presentation, I am a nerd. I am a child of geeks. Like my father was a radar tracking engineer and my mother was an IT specialist. So I was doomed to be a geek. And like my parents are so geeky, I actually just saw them a few days ago. They're so geeky they don't even know they're geeks. Like they're so nerdy, and I sort of talk about them freely and they're like, that's good, honey. But I was kind of raised to be like this. I grew up like my dad would bring home schematics of the radar and teach me how the radar worked, tell me the story of how the radar worked. And then the next week he would bring home that piece of equipment and I would rip it apart and sort of put it back together with a soldering iron. So I was always kind of raised to kind of be a geek, but also to know that all technology is a story. And so as I was kind of coming up, I started very, very young. I started taking computer classes when I was 10. So I went to the local college and so started doing that and took a lot of computer classes. I was a software coder for quite some time, sort of why I was in high school. And then everybody actually said, well, you should go to a technical school, that I should go to, I grew up on the East Coast, so I should go to Virginia Tech, I should go to MIT, there's all those places I should go. And I actually said I didn't want to go there, that I actually wanted to go to this school called the New School for Social Research. And everybody was like, what? And actually what everybody says is the New School for what? Which the New School for Social Research, for anybody now, it's where Project Runway happens. It's where Parsons School of Design is. It's this wonderful school that is completely interdisciplinary. It's in Manhattan. And for me, I loved it because growing up where I grew up, I didn't have access to everything. And so they had an economics school, they had an engineering school, they had a design school. So for me, I was allowed to take classes all over the place. So I had this fiercely interdisciplinary approach to my education, and at the same time with the backing of engineering. So I've kind of always had this dual background between kind of engineering and kind of math, but then also design and that approach. And so when I got out of school, which you could ask me, my first job out of college is I was a zombie hunter for the US government. I would explain another time. But I also then became a product guy. So I did interactive television, building products. And that was really what I did early on. And we made interactive television in Europe and in Scandinavia back in the 1990s. And to do that, you had to have an understanding 5 to 8 years out of what the product would be and what it would be like. And so we did that for some time, and then that's when Intel kind of came to me and said, we're doing this chip design, we'd like you to come and do that. And I was an architect, I'm a systems architect, that's kind of what I do. And it was only in 2009 that they came to me and said, we want you to be Intel's Futurist.
Interesting.
And I said no. I said, no way, are you kidding me? That puts like a big target on you. Because as most of you are probably thinking, like if you want to ask me a question, you go, okay, Futurist. Like that's what everybody has, is they like want to know. Like, and so it became this thing, but I ended up saying yes because a lot of the work that I'd been doing, I had a lot of people come and a lot of students who actually said, well, that's actually what you were doing. And I said yes, and it's been just amazing ever since.
Good.
And so my advice to be is fiercely interdisciplinary, but also I think the biggest thing is to always be curious. That's one of the things that has driven me. It's what drove me to New York City. It's what pulled me out to the West Coast, is to always be curious. And I talked a little bit about it before. Always be curious, even about people who don't agree with you. Like always be curious. Like if somebody like really gets on your nerves, like go at that. You'll find that's one of the things I always do. It's like, oh, does that upset you? Why does that upset you? Tell me more about that. I think that is really fascinating, that you can just keep, I actually can be annoying sometimes at parties. Be like, oh, tell me about that. But that sort of insatiable curiosity will always, that sort of well you can always go back to.
One of your themes is changing the story, right? The story of what technology is and what it can be. Specifically in your mind, what do you think are the best ways to change the story? I mean, you've got 1,000 people in front of you. What do you tell them specifically? You know, how do you go about getting them to change the story for themselves, but also for the story of the people around them?
I think the first step is to be curious, and that all the work that I do is all based on fact, right? So all of this work is based on doing research and kind of getting an understanding of where things are going. So having that, you still have to be able to do the math, right? You still have to have an understanding. But then it's to have an opinion. As I said during my talk, is have an opinion about where you want it to go, and think about what is that future you want, but more importantly, what is the future you want to avoid? I think this is one of the things that as a futurist, I do a lot of, and I actually do it with my company as well, to say, what are those dark futures? You know, what are the things, what are images of the future that would suck? Like, let's look at those things and have conversations about those and figure out how we avoid them, because they are going to be there. But in that process, you begin to understand that you actually do have control over that. And then the biggest thing is to be collaborative, is to go out and start talking to people. And the more people you can talk to, that's actually how it happens. I've seen it happen. I've seen it happen at schools. I've seen it happen at my own company, that the more conversations you have, you actually begin to see people make that change.
Yeah, you bet. You make a good case that people are the ones who put humanity into machines. They bring their culture and their ethics and put them in machines. I want to turn that question on its head a little bit. Can technology put culture into people? Can it change our ethics, and does it? If you think so, then how?
Well, that's the funny thing about machines, right? Machines are tools. And so tools, and our ability to use tools is closely allied to our evolution as a species. And a great example is the hand axe, right? So the hand axe, really, really primitive tool. And the hand axe was created by people for chopping and cutting and doing that work, which it helped us, right? It was an extension of ourselves and allowed us to do more work. It allowed humans to do more work. But then it turns out that our hands evolved to use the hand axe. Right? Evolutionarily, if your hand was better designed to hold that hand axe, you did better. And so you changed. And I would say that technology and the work that technology does, it does change us. That we make technology, we make these machines, we do imbue them with what we believe, and then it changes us. That we have this very symbiotic relationship with our tools and with our machines. And I think it's a very healthy one. It's one that allows us to adapt. That's the thing about human beings that has made us such a winner when it comes to evolution, right? The saber-toothed tiger, we won. You know, we weren't faster, we didn't have long teeth, but what we could do is we could adapt. And we're really adaptive, and I think that's one of the things. And I think another thing that, especially now with information age technology, what it has done is it has pulled down so many silos. That what it has done is it has given us access to people and to information that we've never had before. And that's how you make culture change as well, through those conversations. I mean, probably one of the things that you will see in your careers, especially in education, is the way that research is done. The way that learning is done is fiercely international now. Like well, you know this, I would challenge you to go to any journal article, any science article, any humanities article that's out there around research, they're all international. Because we now have this ability to collaborate with people literally at the speed of light. And it's changing how research is done, it's changing how education is done. And again, by broadening that conversation, I think it's making those conversations much, much stronger.
Good. Let's talk about the future.
What?
Yeah, let's talk about some technological trends. And I'm interested in what's happening now and what you think is going to happen in the future. And I know you have a real interest in robotics. So I've seen a number of pundits claim that we're on the precipice of a huge robotics revolution. And so I'm interested in what's going on at Intel and other places that you've seen, and more importantly, what are the implications of a revolution in robotics?
Okay, that's a big one. Okay, so at Intel, what I argue at Intel is that you always have to remember is we're a manufacturing company. We make a complex product on a massive scale. That's what we do. And what I tell my colleagues, and I told them for some time, is that don't think of us as a laptop company or a tablet company or a smartphone company or whatever. What we manufacture is computational intelligence. So we can basically make anything smart. So from everything to the high performance computers that run CERN, all the way down to things that would be in your watch or in your wearables, that we make anything smart. And so at Intel, that's what we're starting to do. You've seen us start to make that shift. And those are some of the chips that I'm designing. We were actually talking backstage about this. I think I still have it. So this is the Intel Edison chip. This is one of the chips that I helped design. And the whole idea is that we want to be able to then be able to make this chair smart if there's a good reason to make the chair smart. And you'll see that as the company is changing, that we're starting to think about it in that way. How do we have computing that moves from supercomputing all the way down to getting your tie to compute, if it makes sense for your tie to compute? That's kind of how the company is thinking of it. Now for me, that's that world that I was thinking of is not only the ability to turn anything to a computer, but the fact that we'll have more computational power as we pass that 2020 timeframe that I talked about. When you have compute move to zero and you can turn anything into a computer, it means that we have more computational power in the world around us than we do in our devices. So it's a fulcrum point that we pass. It means that, now we live in a world of devices and these screens, and when you can turn anything into a computer, it means that our buildings become smart, and our cities become smart, and our cars become smart. And that is something radically different, sort of how you design software, how you design services, how you design businesses around that, because you're tapping into this huge wealth of big data, of all this information. These devices, though, don't go away. These devices actually become more important because they're the means and the windows through which you'll tap into all of that intelligence. But when you can turn a building into a computer, what will you optimize it for? Not only just efficiency, which we were talking about before, but could you optimize it to make you laugh? Like imagine, you optimize your car to make you laugh on a Monday, because Mondays can suck sometimes. And maybe you optimize it for having a good time on a Friday. I think that is how we kind of bring more humanity into what we're doing. And then the final piece is, yes, I've been doing a lot of work in robots. I have a project called 21st Century Robot. It's an open source 3D printable robot that you can kind of design and print your own robot. And then to program it, you only need, you don't need a PhD, you don't need to know how to program robots, you just download apps. So it's kind of like a smartphone with legs that kind of walks around. And there's lots of stuff about it. We just launched it about a year ago, and it's kind of out. If you're interested in it, it's called 21st Century Robot, which it's this notion that anybody should be able to design, develop, and program their own robot. That robots should become as ubiquitous as the internet. And that's really the idea, is that we should be able to use them. I mean, I think most of you, or many of you in the audience, have never really known a time when there wasn't the internet. Right? If you pick up a device and that device doesn't have the internet, that device is broken. Like, that's stupid. What's this device good for? I don't want this device. It gets weirder if you go to a coffee shop and the coffee shop doesn't have the internet, the coffee shop is broken. You're like, why would we stay here? Let's go to some place that's got Wi-Fi. Imagine living in a world if you go to a coffee shop and it doesn't have a robot, or you go to a house and it doesn't have a robot, then that house or that coffee shop is broken. Like, what would those robots do for us? And so I think that is transformational, not only in how we live with robots, but also it can have a big transformation on businesses as well, small to medium businesses. What would it mean to not have a mom and pop shop, but to have a mom and robot shop? Like, what would those robots do? I think it can have a huge, huge effect.
Yeah, you bet. The implications for a revolution in robotics are huge. From an economic standpoint, from a social standpoint, from a macroeconomic standpoint, robots, hold out the prospect of increasing our productivity by a great amount, and that offers an opportunity to shift our activities from one value-creating activity to another, one that might be more valuable or more interesting to us. That's nice. But there are also some warnings out there about this change, that in some sense we might be repeating history. In the early 19th century, we went through a very extreme period of increases in productivity, and it led to a number of social changes in terms of the structure of the way people did work, where they did their work, and what happens to them and their families, especially around the issue of technological unemployment and uprooting the agrarian culture. Some people are concerned that that kind of thing might happen again, and we need to be ready for it. So I'd be interested in sort of what role you see Intel having, in managing that process.
Yeah, so that's the idea of technological kind of unemployment and sort of where things could be going. There's many people who've written that, the march forward of technology, again, we have a very deep relationship with technology and our kind of forward path around where things are going. And a lot of folks have written that if a machine can do your job, if a computer can do your job, and many would say if a robot could do your job sucks. Because it's not embracing that fact of what you're really good at as a human. That if you can systematize it, that what we are doing is we're turning human beings into machines. That's a lot of what happened with the Industrial Revolution, is we were turning human beings into machines. We couldn't get a machine to do something, so that we had a human being do it, so then the machine could do it. As we get more computational power, as we get more intelligence, we will have more robots and more machines doing work. And that's a good thing. That is a very good thing. Now, although it should be said, and this is one of the things that we are very cognizant of the fact and respectful at Intel, is this notion that, yes, granted, if a machine can do your job very well might have sucked, but your paycheck didn't suck. Like, your paycheck was a good thing. And so we need to come to grips with that. We need to have a plan for that, because we know we're going to have more computational devices. We know we're going to have more robots. And so one of the things that you see Intel doing, and one of the things that I do a lot of work with, is you have a renewed focus on education and how we think about education. Because if a machine can do your job, that then frees you up to do things where you are more creative, where you can make more decisions, where you can actually do what humans are good at, things like emotional intelligence. Right? Human beings are really good at interacting with other human beings. Right? Actually, the machines allow us to do that. They free us up to do that. Turns out humans are really good at something called disparate cognitive synthesis, which is really taking a lot of different ideas, putting them together in a different way, and coming up with a different idea. And this is this notion that 1 + 1 = 2 is math. 1 + 1 = orange is genius. Right? This idea that human beings could put two things together that would normally go together and come up with something that's completely different. That's where innovation comes from. And the machines are really bad at that, but humans are really good at it. And I think as we start thinking about that, we have to think about not only how we think about education, but how we treat education, not only in our educational institutions, but culturally, how we think about ourselves. That we're not just stamping out, you are a doctor, you're a lawyer, you're an engineer. That we have to understand that as we move through life, that's going to change. And how we are educated, this goes back to my always be curious. That if you're in this state, you're sort of constantly being educated and constantly being curious and constantly following your passion, that's one of the ways that you don't get caught behind that wheel, that you are always constantly moving forward and being curious and learning more things, and so that you don't become outmoded.
Curiosity is going to be a key to success. When you think about the different skills and abilities that young people can have, which ones do you think are going to be most important going into the future? And which ones are going to become more important other than curiosity?
Learn to code. Period. That's it. Learn to code. Literally, that's when people ask me that, I tell everybody to learn to code. Not because you're going to be a software engineer. I don't mean that at all. When you learn to code, coding is just a language. It's the language that we use to act and interact and communicate with machines. It's how we talk to machines and how machines talk to us. And when you learn to code, you begin to understand two things. Number one, that algorithms and these things that I talked about, they're absolutely beautiful. Like, what you can design a machine to do, how you can imbue it with what you want to get done is really amazing. Then the other thing that you learn is machines are really stupid. They're really dumb. They can only do what you tell them to do. They can only do this task, then this task, then this task. And by the way, if you don't do it in this way, it breaks. And so you begin to see the value of human intellect. You begin to see the value of that curiosity. So I always tell people to learn to code, because just like learning Mandarin, just like learning Spanish, it's another language that's going to become incredibly important regardless of what you do. I think that's number one. I think number two is going back to that balance of emotional intelligence, of the humanities, so on one hand I tell people to learn to code, but when I go and talk to different deans of, say, engineering schools, what they'll tell me is that their best coders are young women who are also studying dance. That in the future of where we're going with business and where we're going with engineering, it is that disparate cognitive synthesis. It is that ability to take these different ideas and put them together. And that, I think, is going to be an incredible skill going forward. Is not to say, I'm left brain, I'm right brain, because you all know that that's completely false, right? That's not true. That some of the most creative people I know are engineers, and some of the most really artistic people I know are scientists, right? That you've got these two different ideas, and that it's really about bringing those two things together.
One of the most interesting technological trends that I'm seeing is in healthcare, in the healthcare sector. Most notably, we're seeing new technologies that allow us to diagnose healthcare issues, not just earlier, but in much more remote locations, and that changes the whole equation for healthcare delivery. What kinds of innovations are you seeing? What do you think might happen in the next 10 years, and what are the implications?
So one of the things I'm most excited about is synthetic biology and gene sequencing. It's one of the things I've been doing a lot of work on recently, and it's the ability to analyze the DNA of anything living. Humans, one thing, when it comes to healthcare, but anything, plants, animals, what have you. And to understand the DNA of that, to understand the state of that system, and then be able to go and take action. So one of the things when it comes to remote healthcare, I'm doing a lot of collaborating with people, of being able to take, when it comes to, say, the treatment of cancer. Everybody's cancer is individual, right? Everybody's DNA is individual, so everybody's cancer is individual. And there's a group actually now called the Pink Army Cooperative, a guy by the name of Dr. Andrew Hessel. And Andrew is working on a way to use DNA sequencing to be able to treat your cancer, right? To treat the specific individual's cancer, because that cancer is not only specific to them as an individual, but it changes not only month to month, but also day to day. And so how you do healthcare becomes hyper-personalized healthcare. So cancer is a great example because it's this, awful thing, but it also works for any number of diseases, any number of heart conditions, any number of diabetes, that being able to kind of understand the human state is incredibly important, because then you can take action on that state. And also helps with preventative as well, that once you have an understanding, if you have a predisposition to certain conditions, you can start taking action today, which becomes incredibly important from a healthcare standpoint, because again, as we look out to the future, we're going to have a whole lot of old people and a whole lot of young people. Right? And we're going to have the distribution of those people in a lot of different areas. And so being able to do remote healthcare becomes really, really important, and being able to take action there. And that's one of the things that just gets me so incredibly excited, is that we can actually use this intersection of digital technology and biology to really make people healthier.
Yeah, you bet. Let's talk about fun. Nerds like to have fun. What do you see as the future of entertainment? You get a chance to talk to, I bet, a lot of gamers, a lot of engineers who are gamers on the side, and other people who are not engineers. Where do you see things going in the entertainment field?
Well, I mean, the thing I think, so one of the things that I had done, and one of the things I did early when I came to Intel, there's a lot of work on the future of TV. So did a lot of work of sort of where future was going. That wrote a book on it called Screen Future, which was kind of looking at, this was this radical notion back in 2005 that TV wasn't TV anymore, that TV was a mix of TV and movies and games and social networking. And back in 2005, I said, oh, and by the way, we're going to be watching TV and movies and games on things like this, and we'll be being able to make phone calls on our TVs and sort of all the stuff that we have now. But one of the things in doing that research was the fact that, really two things. Number one is that people love stories, that our brains are hardwired for stories, that we love stories, and that stories aren't going to go away. TV isn't going to go away, right? That notion of entertainment, of sitting back and sort of getting that story. Now, where we get it and how we get it will change. And an example that I like to use for people, again, because I'm a science fiction nerd, is it's okay if you're not a science fiction fan, but my guess is you've probably seen a movie about the end of the world. Right? Where everything's going, the apocalypse has come, right? And there's always a scene in that movie where the protagonist walks up to the television, turns on the television, and it's like, and it's at that moment in the movie that the apocalypse has come. Because if TV doesn't work, it has to be the end of the world. Which kind of shows you that deep connection that we have to TV, and that won't go away. I think the other side is that human beings are intensely social. So when you talk about gaming, right? That's why gaming, I think, is so important, is it takes narrative and being social and kind of puts them together. That I am a gamer, and I kind of grew up sort of playing games and playing online games. And granted, you are sort of sitting there and sort of obsessed with your screen, but you're also being social. I mean, that it is a new form of being social. And I find that kind of fascinating, that as you look at gamer culture, and gamer culture isn't also just that, that dude by himself playing Xbox, right? There's a lot of, the majority of social gamers, the majority of gamers are actually women and young ladies, and are online gamers. And actually the next class of gamers are actually senior citizens, are actually going out and gaming. And so you begins to speak to the fact that sort of the future of entertainment is about stories, but also about allowing people to be social and be social in different contexts.
Before tonight, I spent some time preparing by looking at an industry report about the microprocessor industry, and two things jumped out at me. One is that Intel has been incredibly successful, right? I mean, Intel controls 75 to 80% of the PC microprocessor market. The second thing that jumped out at me was that Intel has not been able to replicate that success in the mobile computing market. Given those two facts, I'd like to ask sort of two related questions. One, how does Intel see itself in the competitive landscape of the industry and sector? And secondly, how does Intel see itself in terms of being a steward of society?
So, wow, no small questions. Okay, so for Intel, one of the things that both of our executives, our CEOs have said publicly, so Paul Otellini, our ex-CEO, basically called it and said that it wasn't a failure of vision, that it was a business decision. That he and the executive staff of Intel had seen that it was all about laptops, and it was always about laptops. And great, a phone is interesting, but it's not a laptop. And so why would anybody care about something that's not a laptop? Because laptops are awesome, and laptops are great, and it's all about laptops. And it was a huge blind spot. And it's something that they've called on. And then our new CEO, Brian Krasanich, has come out and said the same thing, that it was the decisions that sort of management made about where things were going. And what I have seen on the inside, and that's part of the reason sort of why I was kind of brought into Intel, was to say, how do we start designing platforms? Because the chip that I showed you before isn't for a laptop. That is actually made for wearables and made for the Internet of Things. That Intel's beginning to take our what we're really good at, again, manufacturing a very small, complex product at a massive scale, and saying, how do we then take that everywhere? How do we put it into tables if people want it into tables? How do we put it into ties? But then also tie it back to laptops and tie it back to smartphones and tie it back to the internet, right? All of which kind of runs on Intel. So that's really the vision of the company, is that if it computes, they want it to compute best on Intel. And they're seeing a world of, much like in my presentation, where compute spreads out. It spreads out into our buildings, it spreads out into our cars. And I think if you can kind of see, especially in the past couple years, that we've talked a lot about that. Evidence of the fact that the chip that I showed you was made not to be in a PC, which is pretty radical. I think on the steward side of things, Intel has always had a real deep commitment, not only to education, but to understand the effect of what we're doing. It's one of the reasons why I'm very proud, actually, to work at Intel. And there's lots of different things, and we can go about it, but I'm not here to be an advertisement for Intel. But the thing that has most recently impressed me to sort of leading the industry is the stance that Intel has taken on conflict minerals. We have said that a lot of the minerals, a lot of the metals that we use to go into the devices that we build are very bad for people. Right? They're very bad for the environment, but they're very bad for the economies and the people who are actually doing it. So one of the commitments that Intel has made is to have conflict-free minerals into our chips, and that is a decision that the company has made. It's one that I'm actually quite proud of.
Great. Are we ready for questions? Okay, so hopefully some of you have some questions. And
remember, you can ask me anything, and we also get to have an Oprah moment, because everybody who asks a question gets a free book! No, and anybody who asks, you don't get a free car, it's only a book. It's a little book, but you get it. So remember, you can ask me anything. We could talk about, here's a gentleman right here.
We have Amal Joshi. Welcome, Amal.
Thanks, Jeff. Hi, as a faculty member here at the College of Business and a science fiction enthusiast, I have to ask you this question. So far we've talked about humanity in the machine. I wonder, recent advances in technology certainly make that possible. I'm wondering about the other direction. As machines become more a part of humans, prosthetics, implants, other things that we might be able to do. As a futurist, how do you see the definition of what it means to be human changing over time? And perhaps there's a tradition in science fiction that might help inform some of our thinking in this area. Love to get your thoughts.
It's a great question. I mean, I would go back to and saying, so much about what it means to be human is adaptability. Right? I think for me, as a futurist, how I design it is that human beings are fiercely social and we're fiercely adaptive, and that's kind of what I go to. But you're right, I think what these technologies do is they challenge us to say, what does it mean to be human? Does that make me less human? When my machine can do this for me, does that mean I am less of a human? And there was a great article just recently in Wired magazine by Kevin Kelly this month about artificial intelligence. And at the very end of that article, he says, probably one of the things that is most interesting about artificial intelligence is it will probably continue to clarify what it means to be human and what we value as human beings. Because again, as we get better technology, it will continue to push us and make us change. And that makes us redress. It makes us look back at ourselves. That's one of the things I think about technology that can be kind of uncomfortable sometimes, is it can hold a very harsh mirror up to us. You get some of these and people talk about, nobody has a one-to-one conversation anymore. Everybody's always sort of typing on their machines. Well, the flip side of that is maybe that person doesn't want to talk to you. Maybe there's somebody more interesting on the other side of this. And that's not a bad thing, actually. That's just how it's changing. So I think it'll continue to push it. Now, from a science fiction standpoint, I think what science fiction is really good at usually is looking at the dark side of it. It's kind of showing those dark areas and showing the places that we don't want to go. That's why I think science fiction is so important. I actually use science fiction as a part of my work. I'm a science fiction author, so I actually use these sort of dark science fiction futures, and they become part of our spec. So the spec that I give to my colleagues actually has science fiction stories in it where things go terribly, terribly wrong. Not that we can change it, you can't engineer that in, but so we're sensitized to it. So I'm a huge fan of sort of the dark side of science fiction because we need to have those conversations as well. Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Hallie. I'm a marketing and management student here. So I actually have a few questions for you. My first question is, consumer privacy laws are increasing and people are becoming more aware of this and concerned. And do you think that in the future there might be consumer privacy legislation that may disrupt plans for Intel or any other technological innovations in the future?
So we're at a really interesting time when it comes to security and privacy. What I would like to talk about is sort of the year 2013 and 2014, data got real. Like before that, people thought data was these ones and zeros, these ephemeral things that were zipping around the internet, right? It was, at best, it was maybe a picture that you would take in somewhere. That's what people thought about it. But with a lot of the disclosures that have come out, that we realized that you do have a secret life of data, that you actually have a second self, and that second self lives online, and that second self is digital. And when people started thinking about it like that, they started getting uncomfortable because they started saying, well, what's appropriate? Like, what's appropriate for you to know about that second self? And maybe that second self isn't an accurate representation of who my real self is. And so we're just now starting to have that conversation. And I think it's an incredibly important one. And certainly Intel thinks that it is an incredibly important one because it's going to be really different. Right? And for me, where I always tell people to start is, well, start with the first self. Like, what's appropriate for me here in this room? Like, I didn't stand up when I met all of you and scream out my social security number. Like, you just don't do that. So let's not have our data do that, right? Let's not have you know everything about me the moment I walk up. Let's actually have some protocols in place. And so I think what you're going to start to see, and what we're already starting to see, is different places starting to have different legislation, starting to have different cultural norms as well. It's not just legislation, it's the cultural norms. So you have something like in the UK where you can tell Google to forget you, right? You can tell Google to lose your number, and they have to sort of forget you. And I think you'll start to see those norms changing. So privacy and security in the UK is very different than privacy and security in China, and is very different sort of in the US. And so I think that's a needed thing that needs to happen, because finally we've got to the point where we've matured to understand that we need to be held accountable for that. And so from an Intel standpoint, for us, ultimately we want people to have that. We've always had that as a base of what we've always said, is we want people to have control of their data, that we want people to have that sort of safety and security, and that, because what we've learned is that safety and security is also good for business. And so I think that's one of the things that we're always pushing, is now we need to have those conversations, because for decades we never had them, and now it's time to have them.
Thank you. One more question. So do you think that as our generations now and future generations use technology to communicate with each other, we will lose our interpersonal communication skills?
No. Somebody clapped. I think it'll change. I think it'll actually change. Again, I said sometimes technology can hold up a harsh mirror. But what I can tell you is one of the things also that and I remember I'm an optimist. I have to, is that when I go out and I spend a lot of time on the road. So you go out and you see people like sitting in a restaurant by themselves that are doing this, and people are like, oh, isn't that sad? That guy's sitting by himself, just pushing away. Actually, I'm having an awesome conversation with somebody in Hong Kong, right? That our interpersonal skills are changing. Now, will it mean that we have more conversations with people who are not located in the same room as us? Yeah, that's totally going to happen. But that's been going on for like a really long time, like starting with the telegraph and then the telephone, and so it changes the nature of it. I think it, though, ultimately comes down to personal choice, right? The device doesn't get to decide. The smartphone doesn't get to decide what you do. We get to decide who we want to have conversations with. So it comes back to, I think, a cultural conversation that we need to have with ourselves, with our friends and our family, and in a larger sort of media landscape is, what do we value? Again, what are we optimizing for? Do we want to have these sort of one-on-one conversations? Obviously, I think they're important. I came here to actually talk to you all and didn't Skype in, right? So I think it's important to do that, but it becomes, I think, more of a cultural conversation about what it means to be human.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Brian and Jeff, we're going to take one more question, and everyone who had the courage to stand in line is going to get a book, and Brian is going to autograph it when we finish. So let's take one more question right here, and then yeah.
And I'll keep it short.
Yeah.
So in this time of big data and everything like you were talking
big.
about. It's very big.
It's massive.
So, and you talk about, I can't remember the term you exactly used, but the sort of synthesis of disparate data, how far out are we from computers having a similar ability to synthesize disparate data to our own solar-powered head computers?
So our solar power head computers are really amazing, right? They are incredibly efficient, and we don't even really know how they work. We still are trying to figure out how the actual brain works. When it comes to sort of big data and what's sometimes called machine learning, deep learning, that type of stuff, we have algorithms right now that can do disparate synthesis. The thing is, though, is it's written by humans, right? We have to write the algorithm to teach it to do that thing. And so it can, the problem when it comes to that is it's still limited to the fact, like I mentioned the chocolate cake algorithm before. Like an algorithm is like a chocolate cake. So when you have a recipe for a chocolate cake, you've got the wet ingredients and you have the dry ingredients, and you put together some chocolate, you mix it all together, you put it in an oven, boom, you got a cake, right? So that's an algorithm that gets you a chocolate cake. In that world of that chocolate cake algorithm, there are no strawberry cakes. There are no strawberries, right? Strawberries literally for that algorithm don't even exist. It only looks for what you tell it to look for. So in that way, it's a long ways off. So in one way, again, that's the thing I tell you, where when you learn about algorithms, they can do really, really cool things. There's some amazing stuff that's being done with like supply chain and sort of understanding how to get things literally shipped to stores at the exact time that you need to get them there. Amazon's doing great stuff. There's a lot of SAP stuff that's going on, but it's still all written by people. And I think that's the thing, is that ultimately you're still going to have a human there, because really, especially the next 10, sort of 15 years, you don't have that disparate cognitive synthesis that what human beings can actually do.
Thank you.
Cool, thanks, man.
Brian, thank you so much for visiting Oregon State. Brian will stay and autograph and answer questions interpersonally.
Yep.
And so thank you again.
Thank you. Thanks, man.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.